Entry number 047. Object, preserved human hand, mummified. Right hand severed at the wrist. Blackened skin, desiccated tissue. Fingers partially curled in a grasping position. Small in size, possibly female, possibly adolescent. Remnants of candle wax reported between the fingers and thumb. Attribution, alleged hand of glory. European origin. Estimated creation, late 18th to early 19th century. Condition, fragile. Extensive darkening of the epidermis consistent with preservation and age. Tissue loss at the fingertips. Wax residue present. No surviving documentation from the moment of original manufacture. Provenance, discovered concealed within the wall cavity of a thatched cottage in North Yorkshire, England, prior to its donation to the Whitby Museum in 1935. Classification, hand of glory, folk magic talisman, human remains. This is Strange Holdings. I'm Danielle Christmas. The object behind the glass at the Whitby Museum doesn't look like much at first. It's small, withered, the kind of thing you might walk past if you didn't know what you were looking at. But once you understand what it is, once you read the label, you can't look away. It's a human hand, severed, preserved, deliberately transformed into something else. The object, displayed today at Whitby Museum in North Yorkshire, is widely regarded as the best documented surviving example of what folklore calls a hand of glory. Other objects have been described under the same name. Museums and private collections across Europe have at times attributed preserved hands to the same tradition. But documentation varies widely, and not every attributed specimen carries the same degree of historical certainty as the Whitby example. That uncertainty is part of the story, because the hand of glory exists at the boundary between folklore and material evidence, between written instructions and physical remains. The object in Whitby is undeniably real. A human hand was cut from a body, preserved, hidden, eventually rediscovered and placed on display. What remains uncertain is how closely it followed the recipes described in folklore, or whether those recipes were ever followed exactly at all. According to European folk tradition, when candles were fitted to the fingers of such a hand and lit, something extraordinary was supposed to happen. Anyone who saw the light would freeze. They would become immobile, silent, unable to move or cry out. The hand of glory would render them powerless. It was, in theory, the perfect tool for burglars. The question that haunts these objects is simple. Did anyone actually believe this would work? And the more disturbing question, did they try? The hand at Whitby is evidence of something. Whether it represents genuine magical practice, criminal folklore, or symbolic ritual is still debated, but it is undeniably real. Someone cut this hand from a corpse. Someone preserved it. Someone hid it. And now it sits behind glass in a museum case labeled and cataloged. A strange holding indeed. This is the story of the hand of glory. Not just the legend, though we'll get into that. Not just the folklore, though that matters too. This is the story of the instructions that described it, the people who believed in it, and the objects that may or may not have been made in its image. Let's begin where many accounts of the hand of glory begin, with a recipe. If you wanted to make what folklore describes as a hand of glory, and I want to be clear, you should absolutely not want to make one, you would need a book, a grimoire, a text that documented the secret knowledge of folk magic passed through print shops and private hands circulating at the margins of official religion. One of the most frequently cited sources for instructions associated with the Hand of Glory is an 18th century French text known as the Petit Albert, often translated as the Little Albert. The Petit Albert belongs to a category known as books of secrets. These were practical compilations of remedies, recipes, magical formulas, household advice, and folk knowledge. Some entries dealt with medicine, others with agriculture, some with alchemy, astrology, or protection rituals. And among those entries were instructions describing how to prepare what later writers identified as a hand of glory. According to versions of the text circulated in the 18th and 19th centuries, the process began with a specific requirement. You needed the hand of a hanged man, not simply any corpse, but one executed at the gallows. The symbolism mattered. Execution sites were widely believed to be places of concentrated power, thresholds between life and death, justice and violence. Objects taken from such places were thought to carry unusual potency. The instructions describe severing the hand while the body remained at the gallows, though historians caution that these instructions reflect printed folklore, not necessarily verified practice. Still, the symbolism is unmistakable. The hand, instrument of crime, becomes the instrument of magic. Once removed, the hand was to be wrapped in cloth, sometimes described as a burial shroud, and treated with drying agents. Recipes attributed to the Petit Albert mention substances such as saltpeter, salt, and long pepper. These ingredients had both practical and symbolic value. Salt preserved tissue. Pepper carried associations with heat and vitality. Saltpeter, used historically in preservation and gunpowder production, carried connotations of transformation and potency. The hand would then be left to dry. Some versions instructed that drying should take place during the hottest part of the year, the dog days of summer, when the star Sirius rose alongside the sun. In traditional belief systems, this period was associated with heightened atmospheric force, heat, dryness, and transformation. Other versions suggested artificial drying, sometimes involving ovens heated with specific herbs. Fern and vervain appear in some later descriptions, plants long associated with ritual and folk magic. But again, historians caution, these instructions survive in printed folklore and later retellings. Whether they were followed exactly or followed at all remains uncertain. After drying, the instructions became even more transgressive. Candles were to be prepared using materials associated with the executed body itself. Some versions mention rendered fat mixed with wax. Others reference obscure ingredients whose meanings remain debated among historians and translators. One phrase, sometimes rendered in English as sesame of Lapland, is widely considered ambiguous, possibly mistranslated, or symbolic rather than literal. Once assembled, candles were placed between the fingers of the dried hand. Some accounts describe one candle per finger. Others describe a single candle fixed within the palm. The exact arrangement varies across sources, but what remains consistent is the intended result. Light the candles, and the household, according to tradition, would be rendered helpless. Those who saw the light would freeze, unable to move, unable to speak, aware but powerless. Whether anyone ever believed this literally or whether it functioned primarily as psychological terror is still debated. But the existence of the instructions themselves tells us something important. Someone imagined this. Someone wrote it down. Someone printed it. And others read it. This belief wasn't isolated. Across Europe, the bodies of executed criminals were widely believed to hold unusual power. People collected soil from beneath gallows. They took fragments of hanging rope, believing it could cure illness or bring luck. Clothing, bones, teeth, these objects circulated through networks of belief and exchange. Execution sites were not only places of punishment, they were places of harvest. The hand of glory belongs to this broader tradition, not an isolated superstition, but part of a system of belief in which death, crime, and magic were tightly intertwined. And once the instructions existed, the question became unavoidable. Did anyone try to follow them? So the recipe existed, the belief existed, printed instructions circulated through Europe, stories spread from region to region, repeated in books, pamphlets, and oral tradition. But instructions alone do not prove action. A recipe is not evidence of use. So the question remains, did anyone actually make these things? Did anyone attempt to use them? The answer, like much of the history surrounding the Hand of Glory, is complicated. There are scattered historical references suggesting that objects resembling Hands of Glory were believed to exist. Some appear in court records, others in folklore collections, others in antiquarian writings from the 18th and 19th centuries. But very few accounts can be verified in detail, and many blend recorded events with oral tradition. One of the most frequently cited incidents dates to the early 19th century. Ireland, the year 1831. The location, a rural estate in County Meath. According to accounts recorded later in the 19th century, intruders broke into a house carrying what was described as a dead man's hand fitted with a candle. The object was believed to function as a hand of glory. But the burglary didn't unfold as planned. The household was alert. The intruders fled, and the hand, whatever its intended purpose, was left behind. Later retellings added dramatic elements. Some versions describe servants attempting to extinguish the candles with milk, an action drawn from widespread folklore about how such a device could be neutralized. But historians note that these embellishments likely reflect traditional belief rather than documented fact. What we can say with some confidence is this. An object described as a preserved hand fitted with a candle was reportedly used in a burglary attempt in Ireland in 1831. Whether it functioned as magic, or as intimidation, or simply as superstition, that remains uncertain. And uncertainty appears again and again in the historical trail. Some early modern legal records refer to accusations involving severed hands used in magical practices. In certain witchcraft trials of the 16th and 17th centuries, individuals are accused of possessing body parts believed to hold supernatural power. But accusations are not confirmation, and belief does not equal practice. What survives in the record is fragmentary, suggestive but incomplete. Which brings us back to the objects themselves. Because while written accounts remain scattered, a small number of physical specimens have been identified as possible hands of glory. And among them, one stands apart. The Whitby example, discovered concealed inside the wall of a cottage in North Yorkshire, is the most widely documented. The hand was reportedly found hidden within the structure of the building, wrapped and preserved. It remained there, unseen, for an unknown length of time, perhaps decades, perhaps more than a century. Eventually, it was removed and transferred into museum care, where it entered the collection of Whitby Museum in 1935. The context of its discovery matters, because hiding objects inside walls was not unusual in earlier centuries. Across Britain and Europe, archaeologists and historians have documented concealed items inside buildings: shoes, dried animals, bottles, charms. These objects were placed deliberately, sometimes for protection, sometimes for ritual, sometimes for reasons now lost to history. The Whitby hand may belong to this broader tradition, or it may represent something more specific, a tool hidden after use, a forbidden object concealed from authorities, or simply something too disturbing to discard but too dangerous to display. Other institutions have reported objects described as hands of glory. Some museum catalogs reference preserved hands attributed to French or continental European traditions. Collections, such as the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford and museums devoted to magic in Paris, have, at times, included objects identified under this name. But documentation varies. Not every attributed specimen carries the same degree of historical clarity as the Whitby example. Some identifications rely on later interpretations. Others depend on incomplete provenance records. And in many cases, the connection to the specific folklore tradition remains uncertain. that uncertainty is part of the historical reality. Museums inherited many of these objects during the 19th century, a period when collectors gathered curiosities, artifacts, and relics with uneven documentation. Victorian antiquarians were fascinated by superstition. They sought evidence of magical belief. They cataloged unusual objects, sometimes carefully, sometimes hastily, and not always with the documentation modern historians would require. To those collectors, these preserved hands represented proof that magical thinking persisted, proof that belief could leave physical traces, proof that folklore was not merely stories, but actions. But even then, doubts lingered. Were these truly prepared according to the recipes described in grimoires? Or were they preserved hands later associated with folklore after the fact? We can't always know. What we can say is this: at least one preserved human hand, strongly associated with the Hand of Glory tradition, survives today, and several others have been described, cataloged, or displayed under the same name, though with varying degrees of certainty. The chain of custody exists, but it is incomplete, fragmented, full of gaps, and filled with questions that may never be answered. Each transition, from gallows to text, from text to belief, from belief to object, from object to museum, changed the meaning of the hand. On the gallows, it belonged to a person. In the grimoire, it became a recipe. In folklore, it became a weapon. Hidden in walls, it became a secret. And in museums, it became evidence. But through every transformation, one truth remained. These were once human hands. Hands that grasped. Hands that held. Hands that belonged to lives we no longer remember. And now they remain, blackened, curled, preserved, waiting behind glass, still grasping at nothing. There's something uniquely unsettling about encountering a Hand of Glory in person. I want you to imagine it. You're walking through a museum. Maybe it's the Whitby Museum with its eclectic collection of local history and curiosities. Maybe it's another museum where objects associated with magical traditions are displayed among cabinets of curiosities, ritual objects, or relics of folk belief. You're moving through the galleries, looking at pottery, tools, textiles, and then you see it. A hand, small, blackened, the fingers slightly curled as if frozen mid-grasp, the skin pulled tight across bone, the place where it was severed still visible at the wrist. In the Whitby example, traces of wax have been reported between the fingers, details that helped connect the object to folklore describing candle-bearing hands. The label tells you what it is: Hand of Glory, folk magic talisman, human remains. And suddenly, everything changes. This isn't just a curiosity. This isn't just an artifact. This is part of a person, someone who lived, someone who died, someone whose body was altered after death. Museums have long displayed human remains, mummies, skeletons, bog bodies, preserved tissue. These objects attract attention because they confront us with physical evidence of mortality. But the Hand of Glory carries an additional layer of disturbance. It isn't simply a preserved body. It is a body part deliberately transformed, cut, altered, and repurposed according to belief. The Whitby Museum displays its specimen as part of its broader local history collection. Over time, it has become one of the institution's most discussed objects, frequently referenced in writing about unusual museum collections and regional folklore. Visitors often arrive already aware of its reputation. They seek it out. They stand before the case, and they stare. Other museums have at times displayed objects identified as Hands of Glory or associated with similar traditions. In collections devoted to ethnography or magical history, preserved hands have occasionally been cataloged under that description, but interpretation varies. In some cases, identification relies on historical attribution. In others, on later association with folklore texts. And in many instances, the precise history of the object, how it was made, where it originated, who preserved it, remains incomplete. This ambiguity creates a difficult question for museums. What do you do with an object whose identity depends partly on folklore? How do you label something when its meaning exists at the intersection of evidence and belief? Museums today face growing scrutiny over the display of human remains. Across the world, institutions have reevaluated collections, reconsidering how objects were acquired, how they are interpreted, and whether they should remain on display at all. Some human remains have been repatriated, others reburied, others retained but presented with new context, acknowledging the histories of violence and exploitation that accompanied their preservation. The Hand of Glory occupies a particularly complex position within this conversation, because unlike many human remains collected during colonial expansion, the best-known example originates within Europe's own cultural history. It reflects not distant cultures, but familiar ones, not foreign superstition, but local belief, not someone else's past, but our own. And that makes it harder to distance ourselves, harder to pretend this kind of thinking belonged only to others, harder to treat it as exotic. Some museums approach the Hand of Glory as folklore, some as historical artifact, some as cautionary object. Each approach carries its own message, because when you display something like this, you're not just preserving the object, you're telling a story about it. You can tell the story of superstition, of magical thinking, of strange recipes written in fading ink, or you can tell the story of violence, of bodies cut apart, of human remains treated as raw material. Or you can tell the story of belief, of people living in uncertain worlds, searching for power in places where power seemed scarce. The most responsible displays attempt to hold all those truths at once, to acknowledge folklore without romanticizing it, to confront violence without sensationalizing it, to describe belief without mocking it. Because the people who made these objects, or believed in them, weren't monsters. They were human, and their beliefs shaped their actions. Seeing a Hand of Glory in person is different from seeing a photograph. Scale matters. Texture matters. The fragile curl of the fingers, the darkened skin, the unsettling realization that this is not representation, but remains, not symbol, but body. And once you see it, you don't forget it. So what does the Hand of Glory mean? Not what did it mean, past tense, safely historical. What does it mean now, today? In museums, in scholarship, in memory. I think it means several things, and none of them are comfortable. First, the Hand of Glory reminds us that belief has consequences. Not symbolic consequences, not metaphorical ones, physical consequences, material ones, violent ones. We often treat folklore as charming, as quaint, as something our ancestors believed before modern science replaced superstition. But folklore was never harmless. It shaped behavior. It justified actions. It influenced how people treated bodies, illness, justice, and fear. The Hand of Glory belongs to that darker side of belief, a tradition in which the dead body became resource, material, tool. Second, the Hand of Glory reflects the relationship between power and desperation. The people associated with these traditions were rarely wealthy, rarely protected, rarely secure. They lived in uncertain worlds shaped by crime, punishment, poverty, and fear. Magic in such worlds was not entertainment. It was survival, or at least the hope of survival. The Hand of Glory represents power taken from the margins, power extracted from death, power imagined where power was otherwise unavailable. Third, it reminds us of the symbolic power of the hand itself. Hands grasp, hands act, hands transform intention into motion. Across cultures, hands appear in protective charms, healing rituals, and symbolic gestures. from amulets shaped like hands to healing traditions involving the touch of the dead to gestures meant to ward off harm. The human hand has long been associated with agency, with will, with control. The hand of glory twists that symbolism. Instead of healing, it restrains. Instead of protecting, it immobilizes. Instead of giving power, it takes it away. Fourth, it reminds us that light is not always comforting. In many traditions, light protects. It reveals danger, guides travelers, signals safety. But in the folklore surrounding the hand of glory, light became a weapon. Illumination became paralysis. Visibility becomes vulnerability. The familiar becomes dangerous. And finally, the hand of glory forces us to confront the violation of the human body. Across cultures, the dead are treated with ritual, respect, care. Bodies are buried, wrapped, protected. But the hand of glory represents the opposite impulse: to cut, to preserve, to repurpose, to treat the human body as material. And that discomfort, the sense of something violated, is not accidental. It is the core of what makes these objects so disturbing and so unforgettable. We can't undo what happened to these hands. We can't return them to the people they once belonged to. We can't restore the names that were lost when their bodies were taken, altered, and preserved. All we have are the remains, blackened, withered, curled, still shaped like instruments of action, still shaped like tools of power. Some people argue that human remains should not be displayed in museums at all, that exhibition transforms bodies into spectacle, that it strips dignity from the dead, that these individuals deserve burial, not display. And there is truth in that argument, but there's also another perspective, that removing such objects from view risks erasing the uncomfortable truths they represent, that confronting physical evidence of past belief, especially violent belief, forces us to acknowledge what humans have done to one another, even after death. The hand of glory exists at the intersection of folklore and violence, of imagination and action, of belief and consequence. It's a reminder that ideas are not harmless, that symbols do not remain symbolic forever, that belief, once acted upon, becomes history, material history. And perhaps that is why these objects remain so compelling, not because they're magical, not because they're mysterious, but because they are evidence that people once believed strongly enough to act, strongly enough to cut, to preserve, to carry, to hide. And still, these hands survived against decay, against destruction, against forgetting. Someone preserved them, protected them. Someone decided they were worth keeping. Now they wait behind glass, not as tools, not as weapons, but as witnesses. Witnesses to belief, witnesses to violence, witnesses to the uneasy boundary between folklore and reality. Entry number 047. Object, alleged hand of glory. Human remains, evidence of belief, evidence of fear, evidence of the strange ways humans attempt to control the unknown. Condition, disturbing, fragile, unforgettable. Provenance, from gallows to folklore to concealment to museum display. Still here, still grasping, still holding its secrets. This has been Strange Holdings. I'm Danielle Christmas. Until next time, remember to seek the strange.